Can we do more to strengthen our relationships? Can we do that now, and can we keep doing that?
Hello and welcome to the Waterstones podcast. I'm Will Rycroft, and in this episode we're going to be talking about togetherness. When Vivek Murthy served as Surgeon General in the US, he was surprised to discover that loneliness would prove to be a common feature in the health problems he wanted to deal with. His book, Together, would be essential reading at any time. But during this period of isolation for many of us, I spoke to him from his home in America about why human connection is so important, and especially important right now. Vivek, thank you so much for joining us from the United States. I should ask, first of all, how you're doing, you and your family.
Well, thank you, Will, for asking. And it's so nice to be with you today as well. I'm doing okay. My family, we're all together. My wife and our two kids, who are 3 and 2, are with my parents and my sister and brother-in-law in Miami, Florida. This is where I grew up. And it's been good to be together. It hasn't been easy to manage this upheaval. Every day is like chaos, and we are trying to figure out how to telework while potty training my 2-year-old and making sure my 3-year-old eats and preventing fights from breaking out and doing all of that while trying to be responsible members of the family. And most days we fall short somewhere, but if we can get through the end of the day and everyone has survived, then we chalk that up as a victory.
That's a huge victory. Any parents listening to this will be knowing that you are right in the thick of it with kids of those ages. So I'm wishing you the best of luck.
Thank you so much.
I suppose, obviously, with this extraordinary situation that we're in at the moment, talking to you about your book Together, which is a book about loneliness and the problems that it can cause from a health perspective, has a whole new resonance. But I thought one way we could start would be to talk about the difference between isolation, which is something that we're all learning to deal with in various ways, and loneliness, because they're definitely not the same thing, are they?
So that's a great distinction, Will. You're right. They are different. Loneliness is a subjective term. It's a feeling that the connections that we need are different from the social connections that we have. And in that gap, we experience loneliness. This is distinct from an objective measure. Isolation, for example, is more of an objective reflection of the number of people you have around you. But the reality is, we know that you can have many, many people around you and still feel quite lonely if you don't have strong connections with them, if you don't feel you can show up as who you are and fully be yourselves. Conversely, you can just have 1 or 2 people around you, but if you have a strong, authentic, open connection with them, then you may not feel lonely at all. So it's all about the quality of the connection.
And actually, what's going on at the moment, I suppose, is that people are finding new ways to connect. And in fact, there are many people who are genuinely isolated on their own, but who might still feel very, very connected because of the neighborhood or the community with which they have those connections, which might be becoming stronger now than they ever have before because of what we're all being forced to do.
Well, that's right. I mean, this is a time of great upheaval for everyone, and many of the pathways through which we're used to connecting with people in person, meeting up with friends for dinner, seeing work colleagues at the office, and even seeing strangers who we may sit next to in a coffee shop. These are all meaningful types of connection that we have now found ourselves not able to avail ourselves of because of the physical distancing that we need to do to prevent further spikes in COVID-19 infections. But I think that this moment is also, for many of us, giving us a deeper appreciation for just how important social connections are and have been in our life for a long time. We may have always known that theoretically, but it may have perhaps receded to the back of our mind just how central these relationships are. And we may have allowed other things in our life, like work, for example, to overtake people and relationships when it comes to how we prioritize our time and attention. And this is an opportunity for us to step back and take stock of that and to ask ourselves, are people truly reflected as priorities in our life? Can we do more to strengthen our relationships? Can we do that now, and can we keep doing that long after COVID-19 has disappeared?
With your medical background and through your work as Surgeon General in the States, you're in not a unique position, but in a very strong position to explain something about the evolutionary basis of loneliness, because people will often know that feeling of loneliness, but not know the sort of, I guess, the medical reason for it or the evolutionary basis. This idea of these stress hormones that are accounting for loneliness. I'm not going to explain it very well myself, so I'm now going to hand over to you to maybe just explain where it comes from, why we feel loneliness from our sort of evolutionary standpoint.
Absolutely. And I'll just tell you, Will, I'm sitting here reflecting on our conversation for a second and just thinking how improbable it is that we are talking about this subject. Because if you had told me 5 years ago when I was starting my time in public office that I would be working on loneliness and social connection, I would have said that you were probably wrong. But what happened to me, Will, is that I was really educated and inspired really by the people that I met in living rooms and town halls all across America and in many cases around the world. People who helped me see through their stories that loneliness was far more common than I had recognized. They made it clear to me that the loneliness that I had been seeing so often in the hospital as I was taking care of patients, the loneliness I experienced in my own life as a child and many times as an adult, that was not unique to my own experience, but that was part of a much larger phenomenon of loneliness that has included the United States, the UK, and countries around the world. And as I came to delve more deeply into it, I recognized not only is loneliness common, but it's also consequential, particularly for our health, increasing our risk of heart disease and dementia and depression and anxiety, increasing our risk for premature death, and raising the likelihood that our sleep is fragmented and less restful. All of this became clear to me because of the conversations I was having with people and because I was inspired by the stories that I was hearing. But there's a brighter side to this as well, Will, which is that as common as loneliness is, as harmful as it can be, the opposite of loneliness, which is social connection, can be an extraordinarily powerful force for improving our health, enhancing our performance in the workplace and at school, and even for helping to heal some of the rifts that have developed in societies around the world as we found it harder to dialogue and more prone to polarization.
Mm.
As we think about how loneliness impacts us on a physical level in terms of our physiology, I find it's helpful to think about the evolution of loneliness because we evolved to be social creatures out of necessity. Thousands of years ago, when we were hunter gatherers wandering the tundra, safety truly did exist in numbers. And when we were in relationship with others, we could take turns looking out for predators. We could share our food supply so that nobody would starve on a given day. We could even chip in and help with childcare and other family responsibilities. We helped each other, and together we thrived. But when we were separated from our tribe, we immediately knew that we were in danger. Our likelihood of survival dropped. And that was reflected in our body at every level. Our threat level rose. Our focus shifted inward as we worried about our safety. So we thought about ourselves. And we also entered into a stress state. Now, in the short term, that's helpful. Stress can actually push us to act more quickly. It can push
Mm.
us to draw upon resources that we didn't even know we had. And when we're in danger, we need that stress response to survive. The problem with stress responses is when they are prolonged, when they last for a long time. And so the stress that's induced by loneliness, when it's extended in the form of chronic loneliness, and what starts to happen is that inflammation levels start to rise in the body. Our tissues and blood vessels get damaged. Our risk of chronic illnesses like heart disease start to go up. And that's at least one of the mechanisms that's posited for how loneliness through stress may induce the physical effects that it does on our body.
You mentioned there about how the great flip side to the fact that loneliness can be negative is that connection can be positive, and how it can actually bridge those divides which might seem insurmountable. This idea of community is so important, and we've seen a lot of division in the UK recently because of things like Brexit. We see it in America with the sort of Republicans and Democrats seeming to be sort of polar opposites and never really able to meet in the middle. With these divisions in society, there's an amazing section in your book where you talk about something as extreme as white nationalism, and a man who was brought up within a sort of white nationalist movement being sort of not brought to the other side, but sort of through a community that he met whilst he was at college, being included in things and sort of seeing a different way of living and actually renouncing that white nationalist past, which would seem to many people to be something almost impossible to affect on somebody to make them make that much of a change in their lives. But you believe that kind of social connection is that powerful, isn't it?
Social connection is extraordinarily powerful. It has the ability to transform us, our bodies, our minds, how we think, how we react. And if we look at our own lives, we can see that. Many people have family members who may have hard-held beliefs that they're reluctant to let go of. But when you look at what changes their mind sometimes in a difficult circumstance, it's usually a conversation with somebody they trust, with somebody they love, somebody who inspires them and compels them really to pause and to listen and to look at a situation differently. That's what relationships do. If you look at so many of the movements in the past, social movements, if you look most recently at the movement for LGBT rights, many people's minds changed in terms of how they thought about being gay because they knew somebody who was gay or realized that someone they had known for a long time was actually gay. And then they had to reconcile, how can a view I have about being gay somehow not being a good thing be reconciled with the fact that I know this person, I know they were a good person.
Mm.
Relationship was far more powerful than ads or other curated messaging in changing how people think. The truth is that a relationship is an extraordinary resource that we've had for millennia, but we've lost sight of just how important it is and how powerful it can be in transforming these different dimensions of our life, our health, our performance, our dialogue with community. As a doctor, I have cared for many patients over the years, some of whom had illnesses that I could address with medicines. Others had illnesses that I wasn't able to fully address with medicines. And I would scour the literature often looking for new treatments or therapies for the patients where I didn't quite have a medicine that would work. But all along, what I never really thought about was that there was a medicine that was at our disposal that was just as if in some cases more powerful than many of those that I had prescribed. And that was the power of real human connection. I saw loneliness all around me when I was practicing medicine in my patients, but didn't fully recognize how that was impacting their health and didn't know how to help cultivate the types of connections in their lives that could be a balm, that could be soothing, that could actually help enhance their health and well being. And finally, when it comes to community dialogue, so much of the world is struggling when it comes to political polarization now. It seems that the list of issues on which we disagree is growing, and the
Mm.
list of issues that bring us together are shrinking. And that's a scary realization for any of us who are living now, but also for those of us who have children and are thinking about the future and what society will look like for the next generation. And as we think about how to address polarization, once again, I find that there's an unexpected but powerful role that relationship can play here. This key way to get people to understand each other and to come to a place of compromise on issues, whether it's Brexit or climate change or how to address gun violence in the United States. The key way to do that is not to put people with differing views in a room and have them share their views and then hash it out and somehow come to agreement. That rarely works, although it's often tried.
Mm.
The way to bring people together around polarized issues is actually not to engage on the issue, but to build relationship first. When we build relationships with each other by getting to know someone else, by understanding their experiences, by sharing our vulnerable moments with them and hearing theirs, when we start to find common ground, whether that's our experiences, our children, our fears, or our current way of life and our hobbies, then we start to build a connection on which we can build other things. When we have a connection with somebody, we can listen to them more clearly. We're more likely to pause and give them the benefit of the doubt. On the other hand, when we're talking to somebody with whom we have no relationship, then we're much more likely to put them in a box, to categorize them, based on a simple errant comment that they may make that rubs us the wrong way. And so dialogue gets shut down very quickly. And so I think if we want to build a world that is less polarized, a world that is capable of real dialogue, a world where we can actually take on and address the big challenges that we're facing today, we have to ask the question, how do we build relationship first? How do we enable people to strengthen their connection with each other? And how do we make human connection not just a nice to have, but a priority that we emphasize in our lives, in our school curricula, in how we design workplaces, in how we shape policy, and in how we drive the underlying culture in which we live?
There's a great line in that chapter actually about Derek Black where I think it was him who said, "You find your community first, and then you get persuaded." As you say, it has to be that way around, doesn't it? You can't expect to persuade somebody if you're sitting on opposite sides of a room, trying to sort of argue your way out of a conversation. I wonder if I can move on to your because of your medical background and indeed your medical family, and whilst we in the UK are seeing the extraordinary work being done by our NHS dealing with the current crisis. But there is something about the care and compassion and indeed the connection of medical staff, which probably has something to teach all of us about how that kind of connection can help communities. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. And I think the UK has been a fascinating place to try to understand loneliness. And the UK has really been a leader, I would say, globally in raising the alarm about loneliness being an issue of concern, and is starting to think about how it is that we can fashion solutions to loneliness, whether that comes in the community or in the clinical setting. One of the early conversations I had when I was writing the book was actually with people in the UK who helped me see that in the clinical setting, that many general practitioners in the UK had said that they suspected that loneliness was a key driver for the patient visits that many of them were seeing. They didn't necessarily know what to do about it, but it was clear to them that many of the patients they were seeing were lonely and that that was driving their visits. And the real question, I think, is how can the healthcare sector, nurses and doctors, be a part of the solution? I don't think you can place the entire responsibility for building connection in the lives of patients on the shoulders of nurses and doctors in the healthcare system, but they can be valuable partners. There's a movement in the UK and in other countries around social prescribing, where clinicians in clinics and hospitals will make it a point to screen for and identify loneliness, to open up a conversation with a patient who may be struggling with loneliness, but then will connect them to community resources where they can build community and meet people in the context of fashioning and supporting healthy relationships. And that requires a lot of work to build a system like that. It requires knowing what resources are in your community, which organizations can play a role, whether they're social organizations or faith based organizations. And it requires then building a partnership between those organizations and the healthcare system. But this is so vital because one of the things we have realized so clearly in health over the last many years is that what happens in your community, what happens in your social life, drives your health outcomes. We refer to these often as the social determinants of health, that your access to food and housing and transportation, um, whether or not you're struggling with poverty, whether or not you live in neighborhoods where there's a high level of violence, these all have an impact on your health. But the social determinant we haven't paid as much attention to historically has been social connection, and recognizing that the relationships in our life also have a market impact on our health and well-being. And that's why the social prescribing movement is so interesting. It makes clinicians partners in the larger effort to build a more connected community.
And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, there was a line in the middle of the book where you talk about how even when people are apart, stories can connect us. And part of that is to do, I think, I mean, if we look quite literally at sort of stories meaning books, we know that people who read and share their sort of shared appreciation of certain books will find a way of connecting through another story. But there's also an element of empathy that comes into any reader's experience with a book. The whole idea of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes whilst reading a book allows you, hopefully, to be able to do that with real people in the real world. And as you say, build that connection with people who may not be the same as you or share the same views. Is that kind of what you meant about how stories can connect people who are apart?
Well, absolutely. Stories are how we learn. They're how we communicate. They're how we connect with each other through shared experience. And this has been true for thousands of years, whether we were sharing stories through oral tradition or from the earliest days when we were inscribing images and painting them on the walls of caves. We were telling stories about who we were, about what we went through, and seeking that out so we could understand others' experiences. So that's why stories are so critical. And the truth is that the more open and honest stories are, the more powerful the connections are that they forge. And this has relevance as we think about how we interact with other people and the conversations we have. In the normal world, there are so many forces that keep us from often telling our full story to others. Sometimes we fear that we might be judged, or maybe they'll think that we're weird, or maybe we ourselves will feel uncomfortable just revealing a vulnerability. But what often happens is that when we're able to open up and to share honestly and authentically with people in our lives, more often than not, it actually feels good. It feels empowering, and it also encourages them to be open as well. So, what matters is not just do we tell stories. We all tell stories. That's what we were designed to do. What matters is how honest are the stories we're telling. And when we read accounts from others that are honest and vulnerable, it really strikes a chord within us. We may have layers of cynicism that we built over the years. It might seem like, gosh, people don't really care for humanity anymore. But I don't believe that. I see every day that when people stand up and have the courage to share about their authentic experiences, that others respond. Because at the end of the day, we are still human beings having a human experience. And it is through our short stories that we connect with one another. It's how we understand each other. And so we have to think about the stories that we tell about who we are to others. We have to think about the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. And one thing I worry about, Will, is that so much of modern culture and the messages that young people in particular get on social media is that who we are and whether or not we're successful, whether or not we have value, is linked to our ability to acquire one of three things: wealth, power, and reputation. If we're famous, if we've made it because we're rich, if we're occupying a position of great authority in government or in the private sector, then people say, oh, they've succeeded. You've made it.
Mm.
And that becomes how we judge and measure our own value. But the reality is that if that is going to be our yardstick, we're often going to come up short. And that's going to lead us to think that our value is actually conditional on external circumstances. Whereas the reality is that we all have deep intrinsic value as human beings because we all have the ability to give and receive love. That's at the heart of what makes us human. It's what makes us not just valuable, but it's what makes us healers. Because when you show up in somebody's life with a willingness to give and receive love. That means that you are compassionate, that you are kind, that you are empathetic, that you are generous. And you can have a transformative effect on other people's lives in such a setting. And that doesn't require wealth, power, or reputation. It requires us to remember the extraordinary power that we already have, that all of us were born with, the power that I see in my own children who are 3 and 2 every day as they express love unabashedly to each other, to their friends, to their grandparents, to us, their parents. And they do so because that's what it means to be human. If we want to create a connected life, we have to understand where our value comes from. And when we approach other people knowing that our self worth is secure, it makes it easier for us to connect with them. It makes it easier to share, to be open, to be vulnerable.
And the transformative effect of that connection, if we look at it from a health perspective, because we've spoken about how you can sort of change somebody's mind about something, for example, through connection and community. But you're talking about very real health issues in your book. And what's startling is that somebody who can be quite near the end of their life and seemingly have given up uh, from a health perspective can have a whole new lease of life if they are allowed to have the connection which they've been starved from. And it sort of gives that this idea that it's almost never too late to put some of these things that you've been talking about into practice, because it really can change people's health dramatically, can't it?
Yeah, connection can have a powerful effect on us in the short term and the long term. It can make us feel better in the moment. And if we think back on the experiences where we've picked up the phone and had a really good conversation with a friend, or where we've met a stranger that we just connected with on an airplane or at a bus stop, we know that the positive effects of human connection are immediate. But we know that over time, they also reduce our stress levels and they can have positive effects on our health. One of the things that I think about often, an experience that both moved and pained me when I was practicing medicine in Boston, was that so many of the patients that I cared for would often come in alone without anybody there to make difficult decisions with them when they were trying to figure out what treatment to get or how to deal with the bad news of a new diagnosis. But also at the time of death, there were so many patients for whom the final witnesses to those last days and hours were just the staff in the hospital, my colleagues, other doctors and nurses who did our best to care for the patients we were charged with, but we weren't the same as family. We weren't the same as lifelong friends. And I think about the conversations that I had with so many of those patients in those final days, conversations where I was privileged to be able to sit at the bedside, to look into their eyes, to hold their hands and ask them how they were doing and hear their final words of wisdom. And I think about what they talked about. They talked about relationships, the ones that had brought them joy, the ones that had broken their hearts, the people with whom they wished they had spent more time. What they didn't talk about were the promotions they received, the size of their bank account. They didn't talk about how many followers they had on social media or how much coverage they got in the press. What becomes clear is in the final moments of our life, when we have clarity about what really matters, that it's our relationships that rise to the top. And my belief is that we don't have to wait until the end of life to learn that powerful lesson. That if we take the teachings of so many of those, so many who have come before us, who in the final moments of life have shared reflections like that, I think we can recognize that we have the opportunity right now to make relationships a priority in our life. We're living at a time during COVID-19 when so many of us are finding our lives turned upside down, when we're physically distanced from one another, and our lives are strained in numerous and really unimaginable ways. But this is also our opportunity to step back and ask ourselves if the life that we have been leading is truly the best life that we can lead. It's our chance to assess whether or not our stated priorities, which often center around people, are reflected in our lived priorities. And I firmly believe that this is our chance to put people back at the center of our lives. And as we do that, as we prioritize people when it comes to how we spend our time and attention, then we make it possible uh, to live the kind of life grounded in relationship that I think we were destined and designed to live.
It's a fantastic note to end on, Vivek. Thank you so much. Your book was a great balm to read, but it's even better to speak to you in person about it, partly because just the tone of your voice is enough to make anyone feel slightly more relaxed and positive about the future. So thank you so much for your time. It really is much appreciated. And thank you for Together. It's a fantastic book.
Well, thank you, Will. No, it was a joy to speak with you. It was a real privilege to be able to work on this book and to hear the stories of so many people I met along the way whose stories are captured in this book. But I will just tell you in closing, Will, that I left the experience of writing the book with greater optimism about the future of humanity than I had when I began, because I came to see through the people that I met that our drive to connect with each other is still alive and well, even though it may be buried under cynicism and fear and trauma. It's still there. It's still at the heart of who we are. And in times of crisis, that resurfaces, and we find ourselves reaching out instinctively to help others. We find ourselves reaching for a higher level of compassion and kindness, which make us feel good and create ripples of goodness in the world around us. Creating a connected life, it begins with the decisions that we make day to day. Do we choose to make time for people? Do we show up as our true selves? Do we seek each other out with kindness to express? These are the questions I hope we will be able to take into our lives and to consider, not just during COVID-19, but long after it's over. And my hope is that we will come out of this pandemic with not just a greater appreciation for each other, but with a greater commitment to living the kind of people-centered life that I believe we're capable of living.
It's a fantastic hope. I think I absolutely share it with you, Vivek. So thank you.
Thanks, Will.